Okay, so I'd like to say thank you for having me to the ICA. So as mentioned today, I'm going to be talking about high impact, low budget capacity building. So essentially a more frugal approach to the aid industry within our trade. Over the last 8 years or so, I've worked in a number of different regions working on private and public sector aid projects. And I'm going to be briefly touching on just a few of the examples that I've had within this time period. So, first of all, the most basic tool that a miner needs is something to extract the desired mineral from the ground. Now, you would think that this is a fairly simple problem to fix, and yes, for those of you who've worked in Africa, and especially in the hard rock, I'm sure you've seen an example like we'll see here of this guy trying to remove a rock, trying to remove a gem from a rock.
So he's trying to break that crystal out of the rock there.
So this is a very common occurrence that you'll see in Africa, where they just don't have the basic tools in which they can actually effectively remove a gemstone from a hard rock. In Mozambique, we were able to drastically increase the mine production simply by providing them with things like a rock chisel, hammer, and not only that, but when you're smashing a piece of rock with another piece of rock, you're always going to get shards flying everywhere, and you might also hit your hand. So we would also include things like safety glasses and gloves. And we found that with just a small amount of training on such a thing as this, we were able to drastically improve the yield, not so much in terms of quantity, but in terms of the quality, as they were able to actually now extract larger gem quality crystals without simply breaking the rock apart to extract the small pieces. And this was all for a very small budget, because it was simply going to the local suppliers and buying these tools. In contrast to that, we witnessed in Kenya, in the Sava region just outside of Voi, a $12,000 compressor sitting idle in a small mining town. Now, this was donated by one of their buyers with all the best intentions, but unfortunately, given the sheer cost of maintenance and of diesel fuel, they were unable to actually maintain this. I will point out, this isn't the actual one we saw. I had to find something that looks similar because I didn't take a picture of it. But meters away from where this huge, expensive compressor was sitting, the miners were still hand-digging tunnels up to 50 meters deep and still breaking open the rocks using other rocks. So the sustainability of a $12,000 compressor in this situation was just never going to be sustainable. In contrast, had they been given one more like the one down the bottom, we've seen other cases in Africa where they've been provided with compressors that cost less than half of what this one cost. They're more portable, they're more fuel efficient, and they also would have been left with another $5,000 or $6,000 to buy ventilation systems, to get more training, even just to contribute to fuel costs. So unfortunately, though the best intentions were there, and they were provided with a fantastic piece of equipment, in reality, the actual needs of the community needed to be much better considered. And to give you an idea of the sort of conditions in that particular mine and how they feel about it, I've just got a short clip as we're going about 50 meters down under the ground in Kenya, looking for Savarites.
From outside, around there, 50, 45, I think. But our major problem, we don't have power. You see, if you get power, we don't supposed to go with that tunnel like this. You're supposed to go with the tunnel of which you can stand. Frequently, you see?
And more comfortable.
Comfortable, but you can see here now, the air now is like a problem. You can see.
Yeah, very difficult to breathe.
The best, yes.
So that was about 50 meters under the ground there. And you can see, again, his main concern was a lack of power. And he'd been provided with power, yet through poor planning, it had meant that there was no sustainability to the donation that had been given to them. Next, I want to talk about simple exposure. So we're in an industry, and we've sort of touched on it a little bit today, where your source is everything. And especially as a supplier, you never really want to give away who your suppliers are, hence it being in a situation where you might lose your link in the supply chain. When you're talking about the extreme upstream end of the supply chain, this isn't always the case. So we've worked with our good friend now, known as, his name is Tahiri Kamara, in Madagascar, and he started off as a very small-scale cutter working with very low-quality gemstones. And though we never actually directly invested cash into his business, we gave him small donations of tools and equipment, which are usually far more expensive in Madagascar. But what really made the difference for him was simple social media exposure. And through this exposure, he has become quite a major player in the small-scale gem dealing sort of industry of Antananarivo, the capital of Madagascar. He's now also been able to purchase outside office and cutting facility, whereas before he was literally sitting next to his bed in his one-room house. And also just the simple act of just continued business has really sort of pushed him forward. And the thing is, by growing his business like this, it meant that it worked well for everyone. We didn't have much fear of giving away the source, because we knew that the more that he grew, the better he could supply us. So he's now gone from supplying us with very small, low-grade stones to actually being able to source quite good material, and all because he's actually been able to develop his business partially through us helping promote his business. And I just want to show you a quick little excerpt of Tahiri talking about his business and his thoughts on his business and his thoughts on the building and the promotion that he's received.
Amle sehatra le azo ataoko zany a dia manana fanantenana fa rehefa hitako zany izy ho mavela, rehefa hitako hoe afaka hiasa tenany hanao ny asako manokana, mety hoe mba afaka hivarotra vato andeha direct tany ivelany any sy mba hamelomako ny tenako afahako mampiditra mpiasa nangana orinasa lehibe an'irina zay. Isarona aloha ny anisan'ny client, anisan'ny olona voalohany araka nanao varotra aminazy zany izy. Dia izy koa anisan'ny fampiankina foana zany zay rola amin'ny resaka asa, mandefa entana any aminy izy mampitahy vato ana, izy koa manaparitaka le asanay amin'ny YouTube, ohatran'ny hoe miteraka publicité zany le izy. Dia nahafahako nahazoana client maromaro avy any ivelany. I bought lapidary, I love stones, I love my work, I love my job.
He's the best smile in Madagascar. So next I want to talk about probably something that's the closest to my heart, and that is teaching. And I feel that knowledge can be the most frugal form of value addition. So over a 3-year period, we worked with the Tiffany & Co Foundation, the universities of Queensland and Delaware, and also the German government organization known as GIZ. And what we were doing was conducting a program teaching them the basic elements of field gemology. Now, in this course, they learned a little bit of basic geology to understand the deposits they were working in. We gave them some information on gem identification, on synthetics and treatments and imitations, a little bit on the equipment that they would be using, and most importantly, we gave them an idea of how to grade the rough that they were selling. We couldn't tell them the price, which is the question they were always asked. How much is a sapphire worth? We would have to say how long is a piece of string. It's not as simple as that. But by giving them a way to actually grade the stones, it would actually give them more confidence in what they were doing and have a better idea of which ones were the stones of value. We found that on a further study, that coming back 3 years later, on average, they were getting about a 9-fold increase in their profits. This was actually higher with the miners, as they had the least information to begin with, but a little bit lower with the brokers, as they already had a slightly existing knowledge base. And we were actually able to provide this teaching to over 150 students, with the majority being women, as that was the focus of the project. They got the toolkits, they got the books, and this was all completed for about 10% of what you might expect such a project to be completed on, all through very careful planning and taking into consideration exactly what they needed and essentially running it on a shoestring. But what we were also really happy about is the fact that in doing this kind of capacity building, a project like this is a very sustainable approach, because when we leave, it means the project we can still actually continue because there's nothing to run out. The knowledge is still always going to be there. They're always going to be able to have this knowledge and get the higher price. And we both saw and encouraged them to actually transfer this knowledge, where we actually had one situation of a grandmother teaching her children and her grandchildren and her communities all at the same time. So it was very encouraging to actually see how keen they were to pass this knowledge on and actually be able to benefit the whole community. Next, I want to talk about lapidary centers. So, is a lapidary center the answer? It's a great way to create in-country value addition, and yet it really needs to be planned out in a very careful way, really taking into account the actual needs of the community. So this is the Ladies Lapidary Center that we work with in Sakaraha in southwest Madagascar. And it's a labor of love. It's something that we haven't really been able to leave. We have to continue giving it support. And we found that it was quite a good example of where large budget can be both good and bad. In the good sense, there was a purchase of a €3,000 ultrasonic drill, which at the time seemed like a very expensive, unnecessary purchase. But because the ladies were so focused on drilling the cabochons that they were making and making bracelets, beaded necklaces, and that type of thing, it was a fantastic investment and a fantastic use of money. But in the beginning, we were just very skeptical of €3,000 on a single piece of equipment. That said, they were also provided with faceting machines. And these faceting machines have essentially sat idle as the learning curve and the time needed to cut the stones and the lack of funding to be able to purchase good quality rough to cut has meant that they've just had very little interest in actually using these faceting machines. Also, with the lack of funding, they can't purchase the rough to cut. So that was a big spend, which didn't actually work out that well. Then you have also social issues where the people selected for cutting, for faceting, were selected based on talent rather than on social grounds, and that caused a few social issues as well. You have examples like Ethiopia, where there's been 17 lapidary centers set up, and at this stage, to the best of my knowledge, there's only 2 still functioning. So you can see that you really need to plan them well to actually make it functional. I've also had a first-hand account of a faceting workshop that was set up in Africa. I spoke to the person who was actually the buyer of this. They had set up with $40,000 US from a major aid organization, really good faceting workshop, possibly with maybe 2 complicated faceting machines. And after the training was completed, about 3 or 4 months later, everything was sold back for about $5,000 and shipped straight back out of the country. So that's about as worst case scenario as you can get with a faceting center. They just, apparently the people working the center, they couldn't afford the good rough, they didn't have an interest in it, it was taking too long, and they just wanted to have the cash in their hands instead. Next, quickly talk about working with what you have. So again, those of you who have traveled in Africa, you'll know that they are amazing when it comes to repurposing objects. You can go down the side of the road and you will see Coke cans turned into toy cars. You'll see, flip-flops made out of car tires. They're very good with that kind of thing. So what we wanted to do was be able to, again, impart knowledge rather than giving them an actual donation. So here, earlier this year, we were back in Sakaraha, and we were teaching them how to build a hand-powered trommel. So for those of you who don't know what a trommel is, essentially it's a machine for classifying your gravel into different sizes. This particular one, we were working on 2 millimeters, and then 2 millimeters to 20 millimeters, and then 20 millimeter plus. Because anything below the 2 millimeter mark is going to be too inexpensive to worry about. Anything bigger than 20 mil, you're probably going to see a 50 mil sapphire drop out the end, so we're not too worried about that. And just, I'll show you how it works here. So you can see all the fines dropping out the top there, the concentrated ore in the middle. And there you can see the ore gravel on my left and the fines on the right. So basically this was built out of old paint buckets, old mosquito mesh, PVC piping, bits of wood, anything that we could find essentially. So very, very low budget to construct, and also very low maintenance costs because you can just screw it back together or put a bit of tape around it, and no fuel because it's all just human powered. And we found that this was an incredibly effective tool for them, to the point where what they used to carry down in 3 sacks of gravel down to the river, they could now carry down in a single sack. This also meant the reduction in physical labor, and also, quite importantly, it meant that there's far less fine sediment being washed into the waterways, as we were removing almost the entirety of the fines from the ore, apart from what was still stuck to the outside of the gravel. And there was also a smaller amount of material left at the mines that could actually be used for rehabilitation. And when we left them at a point where they could continue to construct these, as we had noticed a small industry had popped up around the construction of sieves for washing the gravel. So this was the next step in that small micro-industry where they could now start constructing these on their own to actually sell to generate their own income from the sale of these trommels. Lastly, I just want to touch on a project that I've worked on that is big budget, just to show that it doesn't matter the budget, as long as it's carefully planned, it's still going to work. This is a multi-million dollar project conducted by the Australian government called Australia Awards. We work on the Australia Awards Africa. And basically it draws on bright minds from all over the African extractive industries, and they come to Australia, and we take them to Madagascar as well, and it really focuses on sustainability, local empowerment, industry efficiency, integration and bridging the gap between public and private and NGOs and that type of thing, environmental protection, entrepreneurship, and building lines of communications between nations within the extractive industry. So this was just an extra bit there, just to sort of show that something like this, which has had a fantastic result, and could have been a terrible waste of Australian taxpayers' dollars, but worked out very nicely. I just want to finish again with Tahiri. For me, his last little quote about lapidary, "I love stones, I love my work, I love my job," it just sort of goes to show that there's a lot of negative media when it comes to the upstream side of our industry, and people assume that everything is doom and gloom. But when you meet people like Tahiri and you see how happy his life is and how much he's enjoying it, you do have to sort of take a step back sometimes and realize that it is actually providing a means to live for millions of people around the world, and it's not always as bad as they make it out to be. Just a quick indulgence to some of the people that have worked, or some of the organizations from the projects I've been on, and that is me done. Thank you very much.